On October 4th, 2017, a 61-year-old father of 6 named Tatike Katsai arrived at a hospital in Stellenbosch, which is one of the richest towns in South Africa. Tatike, who lived in the area with his family, had been dealing with some stomach issues over the last several months, and so this day he was finally going in to have abdominal surgery to hopefully alleviate those issues. So, after entering the building, Tatike was checked in, and then before long he was transferred to the operating room where surgeons got to work on him. After the surgery was over, Tatike was transferred to a recovery room in the hospital where he was scheduled to stay for at least a couple of days so the doctors and nurses could watch over him while he recovered and make sure there was no complications from the procedure. And so, on the afternoon of October 4th, Tatike just kind of lounged around inside of his recovery room. He couldn't really do anything because of the incisions on his stomach, and so he mostly just laid in his bed, he watched TV, he relaxed, he ate, and then at some point, some of his family members came into the hospital and they visited with him as well. By the end of that day, the day of his surgery, Tatike was definitely sore from the incisions, but overall, he was in good spirits, and to the medical staff, it seemed very likely that his surgery was a success. Early the next morning, at around 5:15 a.m., one of the nurses in the hospital went to Tatike's room to check on him. And when she went inside, Tatike was awake, he was alert, he seemed totally normal. And so after a brief conversation, the nurse told Tatike that she was just going to get him some fresh linens to make up his bed. And so Tatike nodded a thank you to her, and then the nurse, she turned away from Tatike, who's in his bed. She stepped out of the one door in the room into the hallway. She grabbed fresh linens off of a cart, and then she turned back around and went back into Tatike's room, except now Tatike was not in his bed. So the nurse immediately thought, okay, well then Tatike must have gone into his bathroom because the door was shut. He must be in the bathroom. And so just kind of reflexively, the nurse walked over to Tatike's now empty bed and replaced the linens. And then when she was done, she just looked at the bathroom door inside of his room, expecting Tatike to come outside any minute. But after a couple of minutes passed and Tatike had still not come out of the bathroom, the nurse decided to go over and just knock. And so she walked over, she knocked on the bathroom door and just kind of called out, hey, is everything okay in there? But there was no answer. And so the nurse eventually just tried the handle, and when she saw it was open, she called out that she was coming inside. She opened up the bathroom door, and it was empty. And so the nurse, she whipped her head around and looked back out at the room where Tatike should have been, and she saw, he's not on the bed, he's not under the bed, he's not anywhere in this room. Where could he have possibly gone? And she's thinking to herself, the only door out of this room is into the hallway, the same door that she had used to go out and get the linens. And if somehow Tatike had ran out of that door in the few seconds that her back was turned from Tatike, she certainly would have heard him or seen him. Because again, she was right outside the door and only outside of his room for a couple of seconds. Not to mention the fact, Tatike has major incisions on his stomach and could barely stand, let alone walk or run. And so totally baffled, this nurse ultimately left the room and went and told her superiors. Thank you to BetterHelp for sponsoring today's video. In 2017, I left the military and pretty much right away, I fell apart. The military had provided a lot of structure in my life, and so suddenly not having that structure made me feel like I was lost. Pretty soon, I began resenting all the people around me just because they seemed happy and I wasn't. I sort of figured that these feelings of resentment and unhappiness would just kind of go away on their own, but they didn't. Eventually, with some encouragement from my family and my friends, I sought out a therapist. And quickly, my therapist diagnosed me with depression, something I really did not think I was. But after the shock of the diagnosis had worn off, me and my therapist were able to kind of go back in my life and figure out what was causing me to feel the way I was feeling. And before long, having that perspective really made me feel a lot better. Look, therapy is not for everyone, but it is a great starting point for people who just kind of feel lost and don't really know where to go. And so if that's you, I would highly suggest you give BetterHelp a try. BetterHelp is the world's largest therapy service, and it's 100% online. Get matched with a therapist after filling out a brief survey, and then you can communicate with your therapist however you feel comfortable, whether that's text messaging, phone call, video call, chat, whatever you want. You can also switch therapists at any time for free. Get 10% off your first month at betterhelp.com/MrBallen. I've also linked them in the description below. This hospital would immediately begin looking for Tatike on the grounds of the hospital, but they would do it kind of quietly. They wouldn't call Tatike's family to tell them that, hey, we can't find him, nor would they call police. And some have speculated that either one, the hospital did not think this was an emergency and they would quickly find Tatike and that everything would be fine, or two, the hospital was just so embarrassed at the idea that they lost a patient, they didn't want anyone to know, and so that's why they didn't tell anyone. Regardless, the hospital would search for Tatike all day on the 5th, the day he went missing, and they wouldn't find him. And then the next day, the 6th, the hospital again would spend the entire day quietly searching everywhere in the hospital, but they wouldn't find him again. And so finally on the next day, the 7th, so 48 hours after Tatike had just kind of vanished inside of his room, the hospital would reach out to Tatike's family and they would say to them, hey, is Tatike home with you guys? And the family was like, no, he's supposed to be with you. And so the hospital would say, well, he left 2 days ago, so we don't know where he is. And so Tatike's family is horrified, not only that they were totally left in the dark, but they would find out over the course of this conversation that the hospital had not even contacted the police yet. And so the family, they reached out to the police, and then later that day, the family would meet the police at the Stellenbosch hospital, and then a very public search of the property would ensue to look for Tatike. However, again, no one could find him. Authorities would continue to search both the hospital and also the neighboring area outside of the hospital over the next couple of days, but after they continued to find absolutely nothing, the search began to wind down. And so Tatike's devastated family was left with absolutely no idea what to think or what to do. Fast forward to October 20th, so 15 days after Tatike had gone missing. And on this day, the 20th, there was a construction crew at this hospital in Stellenbosch doing some renovations. And at some point on this day, one of the workers had to climb into the ceiling of one of the floors of this hospital. Now, the space above the ceiling is this tight, cramped space, almost like an attic. It's very big and wide. It's like the whole length of that floor. And really the only people that would ever go into the ceiling are construction workers or other authorized personnel that needed to do work. It's not a place that the public would ever go into. But when one of these workers went up into the ceiling, he had a headlamp on and he's kind of looking around, he's looking for what he needs to do up there, and at some point he turns his head and his light illuminates a person sitting in the corner far away from him, way up against the side in this tiny little attic space. And it would turn out it was Tatike and he was deceased. The hospital had absolutely no clue how Tatike could have gotten up there. Not only is it obviously not a publicly accessible area, but the actual way to get up into the ceiling, the door that leads up into the ceiling, is very difficult to find. And even if Tatike found this entrance into the ceiling, it would have been nearly impossible for him to actually get into the ceiling. Because again, this guy has serious incisions on his stomach from the surgery he got. He could barely sit up, he couldn't really walk, so the idea of him climbing and pulling himself up into the ceiling just seems impossible. Then there was the very strange autopsy results. Now, the full report has not been made public, but Tatike's family had a consultation with the hospital after the autopsy was complete, and they would go to reporters and talk about what the hospital told them. And apparently, the hospital told the family that Tatike did not die from complications from his surgery, and they heavily insinuated that Tatike did not die from natural causes. Something happened to him, and the hospital had no idea what this something was, and that's what killed him. And the hospital also told the family that Tatike likely was dead before he went up into the ceiling. Meaning someone or something killed Tatike, and then someone or something placed him in the ceiling. Again, this is just from the family going to reporters and talking about their discussion with the hospital. The hospital's only official statement has basically been that they have cooperated with the family and they don't really know what happened to Tatike. Now, of course, this is a very strange story, but it gets even weirder. On May 10th, 2019, so about a year and a half after Tatike was found deceased in the Stellenbosch hospital ceiling, a 53-year-old father of 4 named Sandile Sabia arrived at another hospital in South Africa. It was in a city called Durban, which is considered to be one of the nicest and wealthiest places in South Africa, similar to Stellenbosch. Sandile was a builder, and he had been working on a house when he had fallen and broken his leg. Specifically, he broke his femur bone, the bone that runs from your hip down to your knee, the big single bone in your thigh. So just for reference, if you break your femur, you can't walk. So, with some assistance from friends and family, Sandile hobbled his way into this hospital in Durban, and he began to receive care. 2 days later, on May 17th, Sandile was still in the hospital, still recovering from this broken femur, when his cousin came to visit him. The cousin said Sandile seemed totally normal, and that during this visit, Sandile told the cousin that after the cousin left, Sandile was going to be transported from this hospital to another hospital nearby, where he was going to get an x-ray of his leg, as well as talk to another orthopedic surgeon. But apparently, after this cousin left from this visit, the doctors at the Durban hospital walked into Sandile's room to take him and transport him to this other hospital, and Sandile was not in his room. Now, this hospital in Durban was known for their very tight security, and so right away, their reaction was very different than the Stellenbosch hospital's reaction. This hospital immediately contacted authorities and said, "We are missing a patient," and they began a very public search of their hospital for Sandile. But they couldn't find him. On May 18th, so 6 days after Sandile disappeared, the hospital in Durban began to smell this horrible stench coming from one wing of their hospital. And so hospital workers would track the stench to a janitor's closet, and when they opened it up, they saw this black liquid dripping out of the ceiling, and the liquid was coming from Sandile's decomposing body that was located in the ceiling. Sandile's autopsy would be carried out very quickly. However, the results of that autopsy have never been made public, and Sandile's family has not commented on the results of this autopsy. As of today, all we know is that within a 2-year period, 2 seemingly ordinary South African men, who both could either not walk at all or who could barely walk because of their physical injuries, somehow snuck out of their hospital rooms totally undetected by staff and then wound up dead in the hospital ceiling. Some say the men really did somehow sneak out of their own accord and decided to go into the ceiling, and that's what happened. Others say both men were murdered and then placed into the ceiling, and still others think these 2 cases are the best examples of something called spontaneous teleportation, which is the hypothetical phenomenon where a human suddenly disappears and then almost instantaneously reappears in another location. But for now, there is no official explanation, so those are all just theories. And so it's up to you to decide what you believe. So that's going to do it. If you got something out of today's story and you haven't done this already, please put coyote urine in the like button's apple juice. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. We have a podcast called the MrBallen's Podcast that puts out brand new podcast exclusive stories on Monday mornings, and on Thursday mornings, we upload remastered audio of our best YouTube videos. Again, it's called the MrBallen's Podcast, and it is available exclusively on Amazon Music. Consider donating to our charity called the MrBallen's Foundation. It provides support to victims of violent crime, as well as their families. Monthly donors to the MrBallen's Foundation Honor Them Society will receive free gifts and exclusive invites to special live events. Go to mrballen.foundation and click on Get Involved to join the Honor Them Society today. We have 2 additional YouTube channels. One is called MrBallen Shorts. The other is called MrBallen en Espanol. We post near daily content on Facebook, Snapchat, and TikTok. All of those pages are just called MrBallen. If you want to get in touch with me, please follow me on any major social media platform and then send me a direct message. My username is @MrBallen, and I really do read the majority of my DMs. Check out our merch at shopmrballen.com, and if you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit just called Mr. Ballen. It's linked in the description below. So whether I see you on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, Facebook, other YouTube channels, the podcast, wherever, just know that I really appreciate your support, and until next time, that's going to do it. See ya. On July 19th, 2013, 49-year-old Matt Dyer climbed on board a tiny 19-seat Twin Otter airplane that was parked on the tarmac of the Montreal International Airport in Canada. Matt was about to take off on the first of 2 flights that would take him and 7 other adventurous people deep into one of the most remote and wild regions in North America. For Matt, this trip was going to be the most amazing journey of his life. He had seen the ad for this 2-week-long expedition about a year earlier when he was looking through a magazine put out by an environmental organization called the Sierra Club. Now, even though Matt was a lawyer, he didn't make much money. He lived in this tiny town in central Maine where he made a living by offering either free or very low-cost legal assistance for some of the state's poorest residents. But Matt was an avid outdoorsman, and when he saw the opportunity to explore one of Canada's newest national parks that was so far north it was practically in the Arctic Circle, he decided the hefty $6,000 price tag was well worth it. 2.5 hours later, after flying over 900 miles due north away from the airport in Montreal, the Twin Otter airplane that Matt and the others were riding on touched down on a narrow gravel landing strip situated between this huge forest on a mountainside and a river on the other side. After climbing off the plane with all of their equipment, Matt and the 7 others hustled their way over to this stretch of flimsy plywood buildings that lined the runway. These buildings and this entire area they were in was not a part of this new national park they were going to. This was like their staging area to prepare and get ready before catching another flight that would bring them into the park. And so Matt and the 7 other people he was with, which included the 2 trip leaders from the Sierra Club, they would stay at this temporary base camp for the next couple of days, going over their hiking routes and talking about emergency procedures and protocols. And then after those 2 days were up, the group felt like they were ready. And so the group packed up all their things and they boarded the tiny float plane out on the water that would take them to their final destination, this new Canadian national park, better known as the Torngat Mountains. 45 minutes later, the pilot of the float plane began to descend through the clouds to make their landing on a little water inlet. And as the pilot did that, Matt and the 7 others were able to look out the window and actually see the Torngat Mountains for the first time. Now, all of them had seen dozens and dozens of pictures of this area, but seeing it for the first time in person was still shocking. The area looks like an alien planet. The wilderness in and around the Torngats is not the same kind of wilderness we think of when we think about going hiking in the forest or going camping or something. No, the wilderness in the Torngats is primordial. It's like you're looking out at a place from the very beginning of time, like dinosaurs should be walking around this area. As far as Matt could see, in any direction were these huge, jagged mountains that had been carved out of the earth by glaciers hundreds of thousands of years ago. And those same glaciers had created hundreds of waterways between the mountains called fjords that almost looked like blue-veined fingers. And even from high up in the plane, Matt could look down and the water of these fjords were so clear that he could see these speckled backs of brown trout swimming beneath the surface. But while this landscape was undoubtedly spectacularly beautiful and pristine and totally incredible, it was equal parts unwelcoming to people. There are no roads in the Torngats, there's no campsites, there's no facilities, there's no internet, there's no cell phone, and the weather is unbelievably harsh. It's freezing cold and wet most of the time, and then even when it's a little bit warm and a little bit nice there, the weather can change in an instant and become freezing cold and wet all over again. And so, as such, the handful of visitors that go into this area every year are expected to be 100% self-reliant, because this really is one of the most dangerous wild regions in the world. But for Matt, as he looked out his window and surveyed this landscape, he wasn't second-guessing his decision to go into this hostile environment. No. I mean, the reason he was willing to fork over all that money to go on this trip is because he really wanted to experience extreme wilderness firsthand. And so finally, the pilot of the float plane came into land on this little water inlet, and then the pilot ferried the craft over to this beach, and then Matt and the 7 others piled off onto land with all of their things, and then as the pilot turned around and left, the two Sierra Club trip leaders, a 61-year-old man named Rich Gross and a 60-year-old woman named Marta Chase, told the group to pick up their things and follow them. And so Rich and Marta led the hikers about 500 feet away from where they had just been dropped off, up to this slightly elevated, mostly flat area that kind of overlooked the fjord and had this incredible view of all the mountains around them. Now, unlike the temporary base camp they had been at for the past couple of days, this camp was nowhere near any forests. They were basically on a wide open plain that kind of went right up into these mountains. So it's very wide open where they're staying. And so after Rich and Marta instructed the group where to set up their tents, Matt and the others got to doing that. And then after they were all set up, Rich and Marta put a small electric fence around the perimeter of their tents to keep any nosy animals out. And then the group headed up a little bit higher on this mountain near them to take their first group photo. And in this photo, they all look so happy and so excited for what's to come. And over the next couple of days, their trip would go exactly to plan. During the daytime hours, they would hike all of their pre-planned hiking routes all over the mountains and down near the water. And at night, they would eat their food and drink fresh water from the fjord and swap stories from back home. But their perfect trip was about to become a nightmare. I've been married to my wife, Amanda, for nearly 12 years, and I just love her so much. She's so thoughtful, so kind, an amazing mother, and so this Christmas, I wanted to get her something extra special to show her how much I care. And what's more special than a pet, middle-aged, rabid skunk? And so me and old Lungy hopped on my nuclear-powered laptop and began slapping away at the keys to navigate to an online vendor that sold rab skunks. But as soon as I clicked on the link, www.weselllrabbitskunksandalsopudding.com, I knew I had made a terrible mistake. That website was riddled with malware, and so immediately my laptop began to melt down and literally exploded. Luckily, Lungy shielded me from the blast, and then after the nuclear winter had subsided, Lungy put on... And then after the nuclear winter had subsided, Lungy put on his traditional gakti and he said, Lopeta uden drayekeshen, ayutaninen rokeshta roidi NordVPN, which of course in Finnish means stop causing nuclear explosions. Sign up for NordVPN. A VPN, or virtual private network, is a service that keeps you safe while you browse the internet. And NordVPN is the brand name in the space. Not only will NordVPN keep all of your information safely behind their wall of next-generation encryption, but also, most importantly, they will block malware hosting websites along with annoying ads and botnet control. So, if you're tired of your Christmas shopping turning into nuclear explosions, then take Lungy's advice and sign up for NordVPN today. Right now, you can get a 2-year plan at a huge discount, plus 4 additional months for free when you go to nordvpn.com/MrBallen. And it's risk-free with Nord's 30-day money-back guarantee. That's nordvpn.com/MrBallen, or click the link in the description below. Okay, back to the story. In the early evening hours of Tuesday, July 23rd, so 2 days after the group arrived in the Torngat Mountains, Matt and the others returned from one of their hikes. Now, the day had been cold and rainy, but the group was in good spirits. This was their last day at this particular camping spot. The next morning, they were going to pack up and head farther inland to their next camping spot. After Matt and the others had put their gear back inside of their tents, they came back out to see that Rich and Marta, the two trip leads, had organized a special feast for the group to celebrate the successful beginning of their trip. And so the group all sat around eating salami and crackers and drinking rum mixed with lemonade as they talked excitedly about the next couple of days and what they could expect. At some point during the festivities, Matt was tired, and so he broke away from the group. He climbed back inside of his tent, got inside of his sleeping bag, and before long, he was fast asleep. A few hours later, around 3:30 in the morning, Matt suddenly woke up. He had no idea what had woken him up, and so for a second, he just lay there listening to the outside world and just kind of staring straight up. Now, the moon was out that night, so there was some illumination, and as he looked straight up at the underside of his tent, he sees this huge figure move across the side of his tent and then stop right on top of him. And then before Matt's brain could process what was happening, this huge figure began pressing down on the fabric of Matt's tent. And so he's seeing his tent collapsing in on him. Matt's not doing anything. He's not saying anything. He's just watching in horror. And then suddenly the tent rips open and these two arms reach into the tent and they grab at Matt. And Matt threw his hands up in defense and screamed out for help. And as he did that, he suddenly felt this vice-like grip on the top of his head. And then before long, he was being pulled out of the hole in his tent out into the night. And as Matt is being dragged along on the ground, having no idea what's going on, he can't move. All he can hear is this crunching sound, which he would later find out was the sound of his skull and jaw breaking. And he started to smell this horrible rotten fish smell. And then he felt what felt like saliva coming over his face. And then Matt began kind of trying to look around because he couldn't really move his head. And he noticed all he could see was white fur. And it was then that Matt realized he was in the jaws of one of the world's most powerful and deadliest predators. Standing 10 feet tall on its hind legs and weighing as much as 1,700 pounds, the North American polar bear sits right on top of the Arctic food chain. And now this apex predator was dragging Matt by the skull down to the beach where Matt knew he would be eaten, even if Matt was still alive when the eating began. When the bear first ripped open Matt's tent and bit down on the top of his skull, Matt let out that scream, and it actually woke up the entire camp. And one of the first people to emerge from their tents to see what was going on was one of the trip leaders, Marta. And so she jumps out of her tent, and just 3 feet away from her, she sees this huge polar bear on its hind legs diving into the tent to get after Matt. And so Marta instinctively yells out to Rich to get his flare gun, and she dove back into her tent to retrieve her own flare gun, but by the time she and Rich had both emerged, gun in hand, this polar bear had already dragged Matt 200 feet away from the camp. And by this point, the other hikers in the group had also emerged from their tents, and after realizing what was going on, they just stood there, absolutely paralyzed with shock, staring at this bear dragging one of their companions down to the beach to be killed. Then, after Rich fired his flare gun generally in the direction of the bear, it kind of snapped the group out of their paralysis, and then moments later, they were all screaming and banging pots and pans to try to terrify the bear into releasing Matt from its jaws. Matt couldn't hear the sounds of his companions calling out to try to save him, nor did Matt feel any pain. He was in shock. The only thing going through Matt's head as he was being dragged along the ground to the beach was, I'm going to die. I'm either going to die on the way to the beach, or when I get there, then when the bear starts eating me, I'm going to die. And when he thought about this, it was with a kind of eerie, calm detachment. Like he wasn't sad or mad. It was just kind of a fact. This was going to happen. But as Matt was kind of making peace with his reality, Rich fired that flare gun shot, and that ball of chemical fire exploded basically right in front of the polar bear's face. And the polar bear, who was startled by the flare, instinctively whipped its head to the side, up, and then down again, and it didn't let go of Matt. And so Matt was whipped like a rag doll up, and then was slammed down into the ground. And when Matt hit the ground, he heard the sound of his neck breaking. But as Matt was laying there, the bear released him from its jaws, and then behind Matt, the bear turned around and began walking away. And so Matt could hear the sound of its big paws moving away from him, and suddenly Matt's thinking, oh my God, I might survive this. And so he tried to lay as still as he possibly could so as not to attract any attention, and he began repeating in his head over and over and over again, please bear, go away, please bear, go away. But as if out of a horror movie, as Matt is laying there repeating this phrase, he hears the sound of this bear stopping, turning around, and start moving back towards him. And so Matt's just thinking, okay, it's going to come back over here, it's going to bite my head, and that's the end. But luckily, Rich, by this point, one of the trip leads, had run down closer to the beach, reloaded his flare gun, and right as this bear was going to bite Matt again, Rich had fired that flare, and once again, the chemical fire had kind of exploded right near the bear, causing it to get startled. It turned around, it ran off, and this time the bear did not return. It would turn out Rich and Marta, the two trip leaders from the Sierra Club, had chosen a location for this campsite that was so heavily trafficked by polar bears, it was referred to as a polar bear highway. When all of the hikers, which included Marta and Rich, had been given their safety brief when they were staying in those plywood structures at that base camp near the runway, well, part of the brief was whenever you make camp in the Torngots, you want to be at least a quarter mile away from water. Go way inland because the polar bears hunt and fish and walk around right along the edge of these fjords. But despite all 7 members of this Sierra Club expedition being experienced wilderness backpackers, none of them really appreciated just how dangerous it was to be camping or even hiking around in known polar bear territory. And so this is why they ultimately ignored the safety brief and set up their first camp just a couple hundred feet away from the water's edge. And even prior to the attack on Matt, when the group literally saw polar bears wandering around near their camp and even at one point had to fire their flare guns at the polar bears to get them to leave, the group still decided it was best to stay at this particular campsite. Perhaps they believed their electric fence they had set up around the perimeter of their tents would protect them from these polar bears, but obviously that had not been the case. The bear that attacked Matt had been totally unaffected by their fence. Matt would survive this attack, but really only because one of the members of the expedition happened to be a medical doctor, and so they were able to stabilize Matt until help arrived. Matt's injuries were extensive. They included a broken skull, a broken jaw, he had slash marks and puncture wounds all over his head and his neck, and all of those wounds got horribly infected. And also his voice was permanently changed as well, because the bear also slashed his vocal cords. Following the attack on Matt, Parks Canada, which is the agency that oversees all of Canada's national parks, including Torngots, has mandated that any organization going into Torngots National Park has to have a polar bear protection plan in place. As for Matt, he does not make a big deal about his near-death experience. In fact, he kind of makes light of it and sometimes even makes jokes about it. As for the polar bear that attacked him, Matt holds no ill will. If anything, the attack has made him more interested and appreciative of the apex predator. In August of 2014, so 11 months after Matt's brush with death, he returned to the Torngots and even visited the actual site of the attack, perhaps to get closure. Except this time, he was in the company of an armed polar bear expert. So that's going to do it. If you got something out of today's episode and you haven't done this already, the next time the like button asks you to get them cereal, say yes, and then go to the store and buy the huge single biscuit shredded wheat cereal. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. We have a podcast called the MrBallen's Podcast that puts out brand new podcast exclusive stories on Monday mornings, and on Thursday mornings we put out remastered audio of our best YouTube videos. Again, it's called the MrBallen's Podcast, and it's available exclusively on Amazon Music. Consider donating to our charity. It's called the MrBallen's Foundation, and it provides support to victims of violent crime as well as their families. Monthly donors to the MrBallen's Foundation Honor Them Society will receive free gifts and exclusive invites to special live events. Go to MrBallen.Foundation and click on Get Involved to join the Honor Them Society today. We have 2 additional YouTube channels, MrBallen Shorts and MrBallen en Espanol. We also post near daily content on TikTok, Facebook, and Snapchat. All of those pages are just called MrBallen. If you want to get in touch with me, please follow me on any major social media platform and then send me a direct message. My username is just @MrBallen, and I really do read the majority of my DMs. Check out our merch at shopmrballen.com, and if you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit, just called Mr. Ballen. It's linked in the description below. So whether I see you on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, Facebook, other YouTube channels, the podcast, wherever, just know that I really appreciate your support, and until next time, that's going to do it. See ya. In 1967, a man was digging for gold in a forest in Canada when behind him he heard the Just before 11 p.m. at night on May 20th, 1967, a 50-year-old man named Stephen McCulloch staggered into the Misericordia Hospital in Winnipeg, Canada. Stefan was so physically weak that his oldest son, Mark, was there with him, physically holding him up, carrying him into the hospital. When the nurses at the front desk saw the pair walk in, they immediately got up and walked around their desk over to these two guys and said, "Hey, what's going on? What's wrong with him?" And so Stefan at this point is so uncomfortable he can barely talk, but he takes a deep breath and then he tells the nurses that earlier that day he had been burned on his chest and stomach, and now he had this blinding headache and he was so nauseous and he could barely walk. The nurses knew clearly this is an emergency, and so they quickly ushered the pair down the hall to an exam room, and then a couple of minutes later, doctors came into the room and they asked Stefan to show them his burns. Stefan, who was already lying on his back on the exam table, slowly reaches down and grabs the bottom of his shirt and he lifts it up, and the doctors are stunned at what they see on his stomach. There was a very strange burn pattern that none of them had seen before. And so the doctors, they move in to get a better look at his injury, and as they're staring at it, they ask Stefan to explain how he got this burn. Now, what the doctors didn't realize is that Stefan was very conflicted. He knew if he told the truth about how he got this burn, then he would open himself and his family up to ridicule and skepticism. But as he's laying there and the doctors are waiting for his answer, he finally decides that the right thing to do here is just tell the truth. And so he takes a deep breath and then tells the doctors what happened to him. And by the time he was finished telling this story of what happened to his stomach, the doctors had stopped looking at his injury and instead were just standing in the middle of the room staring at Stefan with eyes wide and their mouths open. They were all literally speechless. Within 24 hours, Stefan's story had made news all over the world, and his story had attracted the attention of numerous US and Canadian secretive government agencies who were keen to interview Stefan one-on-one to really find out what he knew. In short, what Stefan claimed happened to him, dubbed the Falcon Lake incident, was a very big deal. However, the farther this story went and the more people that heard it, the more people started to question the validity of this story. It just seemed too unbelievable that maybe Stefan is just lying or this is a hoax. And so before I tell you Stefan's actual account of what happened at Falcon Lake, I'm going to give you a little context about who Stefan was prior to the incident. Because ultimately, Stefan's credibility in your eyes will determine if you really believe what happened to him. Stefan was born in the early 20th century in Poland, and when World War II broke out, he was captured by the Nazis and put into one of their concentration camps. It was called the Gross Rosen camp, and it was located in Poland. During his time at that camp, Stefan would bear witness to the Nazis perpetrating some of the worst atrocities ever committed against humanity. In total, approximately 125,000 people were held prisoner at the Gross Rosen camp, including Stefan. And of those 125,000, 40,000 of them would be killed, primarily on site at the camp, or on a Nazi-led death march. After the camp was finally liberated in early 1945, Stefan worked as a translator for the US Army, helping them continue to liberate other concentration camps across Europe. But by 1946, Stefan was ready to leave Europe and start a new life somewhere else and put World War II behind him. And so he and his wife, who also was held in a concentration camp during World War II, fled Poland with their 3 young kids and resettled in Winnipeg, Canada. And for the next 20 years, the McCullochs lived a very peaceful life. Stefan would find work as a mechanic at a cement factory, and his wife and his kids would make many friends and fall in love with the Winnipeg community. However, the McCullochs' life would take a sudden turn for the worst on May 20th, 1967. That was the day of the Falcon Lake incident. Stefan was a very passionate amateur prospector. A prospector is someone who searches the earth for mineral deposits, usually gold or silver. Stefan would spend much of his off time traveling all over Canada to different wilderness areas to basically hike around the forest and up over the mountains, stopping to hack into the earth with his pickaxe in hope of discovering treasures underneath the surface. Now, Stefan almost never found any treasures on any of his prospecting journeys, but he wasn't really in prospecting for the riches. Stefan just loved being outdoors and being in nature. It was very calming and peaceful for him, and considering how traumatic his earlier life had been, being in the concentration camp during World War II, finding moments of peace in his life was very important to him. And so, in May of 1967, Stefan decided to go out on another one of his prospecting trips, this time to an area called Falcon Lake. Falcon Lake is a fairly large lake located about 100 miles to the east of Winnipeg, and surrounding this lake was a big forest that Stefan had heard contained silver deposits tucked away in the hillsides. And so on Friday, May 19th, Stefan was ready to go on this trip, and so he packed up all of his prospecting equipment, he said goodbye to his wife and his kids, and then he left the house and made his way to the bus stop where he hopped on a Greyhound bus. 2 hours later, he got off the bus at the stop closest to Falcon Lake, and from there, he made his way to this cheap motel that was right on the side of the highway. He got a room, he got a quick bite to eat in their cafe, and then returned to his room and went to bed. The next morning, May 20th, 1967, so the day of the Falcon Lake incident, Stefan woke up early, right around 5 a.m. And by 5:30 a.m., he had all of his equipment either in his backpack or on his belt, and he was making his way out of the motel's front doors. Right outside of this motel was the highway that ran left to right, and on the other side of that highway was this huge forest that Falcon Lake was deep inside of. And so after Stefan left the motel, he crossed over that highway and began walking into the woods. And for the next several hours, Stefan just kind of meandered his way through the woods. He wasn't on a trail. He was just using his compass to make sure he was generally walking in the direction of Falcon Lake. At around 9 a.m., so he's been hiking now for several hours, he looked up ahead and he saw there was a clearing on the side of this hill. And so Stefan walked into this clearing, and two things became immediately apparent. One, he was right near Falcon Lake. From his perspective on this clearing, he could look down just a couple of 100 feet, and there was the lake. And two, the reason this clearing existed and why no trees were growing on it at all is because under his feet was just a huge rock face, like a quartz vein that was running across this hillside. And so this was like the perfect place for Stefan to begin prospecting. And so he set his things down, he got out his pickaxe, he got his welding gloves on, he put on his welding goggles as well. They protected his eyes from any rocks that were flying as he was hacking into the ground. And then he got to work. For the next couple of hours, Stefan very diligently hacked away at this big rock, but he didn't find any silver or anything else of note. And so around 11 a.m., Stefan was hungry and tired, and so he put his pickaxe down, he took his goggles off, he took his gloves off, and he sat down on this rock facing the lake to have some lunch. And as he sat there enjoying his food, all he could hear in the distance were the sound of a few geese down on the lake making some noise, but other than that, it was totally quiet. After he was done eating, he put his gear back on and got back to work. About an hour later, at around 12:15 p.m., Stefan was still hacking away at the rock when, despite all the noise he was making as he smashed the ground with his pickaxe, he could hear a really loud commotion coming from behind him. And it turned out when he stopped the pickaxe, the commotion sounded like geese honking and going wild. And so he dropped his pickaxe, he took his goggles, put them up on his forehead, and then he stood up and he turned around and he looked down towards the lake where he heard all these geese going crazy. And the first thing he noticed was there were some geese on the lake that appeared to be flying off in different directions like they had been startled. But what really immediately caught his attention was not the geese, but what had very likely startled the geese. And that was two bright, glowing red objects that were flying slowly across the lake towards him, kind of roughly over where the geese were. Yesterday, my pet frog, Seagull Lung, and I went to the frog park. And as I watched old Lungy gallop over to his other frog friends to join their game of Hi-Li, I noticed something very distressing. Poor old Seagull Lung was the only frog not in a Halloween costume. And so immediately my parental instincts kicked in and I sprinted over and ripped old Lungy off the Hi-Li field. And then before long, we were speeding home at over 100 miles per hour where we crashed into the front of the house. And then after climbing out of the twisted steel and wreckage, me and old Lungy Me and old Lungy hobbled over to our steam-powered laptop, and after getting that bad boy fired up, I was on the internet looking for the best Wolverine costume for frogs money could buy. But as I was browsing, I got hit by a pua. Luckily, old Lungy slapped me right in the coccyx and said, "Papa, tu vois, NordVPN."
Papa, tu dois avoir.
Papa, tu dois avoir. Papa, tu dois avoir NordVPN. Which, of course, in French means, Dad, we need to sign up for NordVPN. A VPN, or virtual private network, is a service that keeps you safe while you browse the internet. And NordVPN is the brand name in the space. Not only will NordVPN ensure all of your information stays safely behind their next generation wall of encryption, but also, most importantly, through their latest feature called Threat Protection, they will automatically block all those disgusting puas that keep preventing us from purchasing the best things in life, like Halloween costumes for frogs. So, be like me and old Lungy and sign up for NordVPN today. Right now, you can get a 2-year plan for a huge discount, plus 4 additional months for free when you go to nordvpn.com/MrBallen. And it's risk-free with Nord's 30-day money-back guarantee. That's nordvpn.com/MrBallen, or click the link in the description below. Okay, back to the story. And now these objects, they were cylindrical. They appeared to be about maybe 30 or 40 feet wide. They didn't have any sort of emission coming off of them. They weren't making any noise. They were just kind of slowly making their way over towards where Stefan was. Now, as Stefan is watching this happen, he wasn't fearful. He assumed those have to be military aircraft. As it was, this part of Canada, Falcon Lake, is very remote. There's not many people around. And so, logically, it made sense that perhaps there's a military that's doing training exercises in this area. And so, feeling much more intrigued than fearful, Stefan just continued to watch as these red aircraft got closer and closer to his side of the lake. And then when these two craft were about 200 feet away from where Stefan was standing, they came to a stop and they were just hovering in the air. And then one of the craft suddenly turned orange and began going up into the clouds, and then at some point just vanished. And then the other craft, instead of going up, just continued descending very slowly, now very clearly towards this open rock face that Stefan was standing on. Now, again, Stefan was totally convinced that these were military aircraft, conducting some sort of exercise, and so he's not fearful. He is just intrigued by what he's seeing. And in fact, by this point, he had convinced himself that this second aircraft that was now coming down to land on these rocks must have experienced some sort of issue, and they were landing in order to fix it. And Stefan even thought to himself, well, hey, I'm a mechanic. Maybe I can help the pilot or pilots with whatever's going on with their craft. Once the craft finally did touch down on the rocks about 150 feet away from Stefan, it changed colors from red to stainless steel with an orange glow around the outside of the aircraft. And inside of this craft, a really bright purple light came on that Stefan was only aware of because there was a couple of small holes on the outside of this craft where this purple light was coming through. But these little rays of purple light coming out of this craft were so bright that it actually was hard for Stefan to look directly at the craft. And so his welding goggles were still on his forehead, so he pulled them down, put them over his eyes, and his welding goggles had a kind of tint to them, so it was like he was looking through sunglasses, and with those on, he was able to continue looking at the craft. And so through his goggles, Stefan is still just standing in the same spot where he first saw these craft, and he's watching this craft that's now landed 150 feet away from him, and he's fully expecting any minute for the pilot or pilots to come out of the craft and explain what's going on. But at first, nothing happens. And so Stefan is just standing there waiting for something to happen when he realizes he has his sketchbook in his pocket. Stefan liked to bring his sketchbook along on his prospecting trips because he liked to sketch things. And so he figured while he waited for the pilot or pilots to emerge, he would sketch the craft. And so for the next couple of minutes, that's what he did. And then after he was done sketching it, he put his sketchbook away, and then really nothing happened for about another 30 minutes. He just stood there and the craft remained motionless. But after about 30 minutes of the craft having landed, it opened. There was like a sliding door on the side of the craft facing Stefan, and it revealed the beautiful, bright purple interior of this craft. But from Stefan's perspective, because of how bright the lights were and how far away he was, he couldn't tell what was inside of the craft. But Stefan's thinking, okay, clearly now the pilot or pilots are coming outside. And so Stefan felt really relieved, and he was just standing there waiting to talk to whoever was inside. But again, nothing happened. And so now, feeling just plain curious, Stefan decided, you know what, I'm going to walk over there and I'm going to yell into this open door to the pilot or pilots inside and make sure they're okay. And so he starts slowly making his way across the rock face towards this craft and this open door. And when he gets about 60 feet away from the craft, he suddenly stops, because now he can hear from inside of this craft the sound of two voices talking to each other. You can't really tell what they're saying, but very clearly there is communication happening inside of this craft. And so Stefan assumed that must be the pilots, and so he called out to them in English. And the second Stefan yelled out to this craft, the voices immediately came to a stop, and they did not respond to Stefan. And so Stefan is calling out to them in English, hey, are you okay? What are you doing in there? And when English didn't work, Stefan called out in Russian. He called out in German, Italian, French, Ukrainian. And when all of those didn't work, he went back to English and just continued kind of calling out, trying to get them to please come out and talk to him. But he got no response, and no one came out of the craft. And so at this point, Stefan thought, okay, I'm totally committed, so I need to keep going and make sure the pilot or pilots are okay. And so he continued walking closer and closer to this open door of the craft, and when he got about 10 feet away, he was suddenly struck by the incredible craftsmanship of this craft. He couldn't see any rivets anywhere on this amazing piece of machinery, meaning this craft appeared like it had somehow been carved out of one enormous piece of steel, which seemed totally impossible. Also, Stefan noticed there were no insignia on the outside of this craft. There was no flag or anything kind of denoting who was flying it. There was really nothing on the outside of the craft. But Stefan just kept on going until he was standing right outside of this open door. He's only a couple feet away from it, and now he's looking directly inside, and he doesn't see the pilot or pilots. And in fact, because of how bright this purple light is coming out, even with his goggles, it's really hard to see what's inside of this craft. But he can clearly see inside there is some sort of panel in the back of the craft with lots of flashing lights, almost like a computer, and there were other kind of columns of light moving around inside the craft at different angles. But after looking in this craft for only a few seconds, the door suddenly slid shut. And then Stefan, without really thinking about it, reached out and touched the craft. And the second he did that, two things happened. One, the hand that he touched the craft with, he was wearing a big welding glove, and the second he made contact with that craft, the leather glove began to melt. Not even catch on fire, it just instantly began to melt. And so he began frantically ripping the glove off to get it off of him to avoid injury. And then the second thing that happened is the craft began rotating counterclockwise until this vent that was on the outside of the craft, one of the very few things that was on the outside of the craft that actually Stefan had noted in his sketch. He had drawn this grate that sat on the outside of the craft. This grate rotated around until it was aimed directly at Stefan. Now, to picture this grate, picture like a vent you would see inside of a building where air conditioning blows air out of, right? It's kind of like that same size, the size of a license plate on a car. And instead of there being vertical slats along the vent, like you would see with an air conditioning vent cover, on this vent, on this craft, it was like a checkerboard pattern with little buttonholes all over this vent. And so Stefan is looking at this vent, and then suddenly something shoots through the vent, like an explosion that hits him square in the chest and lights him on fire. His shirt is literally in flames, and so Stefan is frantically trying to rip off his shirt. He throws it on the ground, he's stomping the flame, and as he's doing that, he looks up and sees this craft has somehow immediately shot into the sky and is now disappearing into the clouds. Now, Stefan had no idea what just happened. All he knew is his chest and his stomach now hurt tremendously. But before he could deal with that, he developed this unbelievable headache. He suddenly felt so nauseous, and he felt delirious, like he was drunk. Trying not to panic, Stefan, who now is shirtless and badly burned, he ran over and grabbed some of his things, and then he began heading back into the woods to make his way back towards the motel. It would take him several hours of stumbling through the forest, stopping periodically to vomit, but he would eventually reach the highway, he would cross over, and he would make his way into the motel right around 4 p.m. And when he got there, he made his way into the cafe, and he asked the staff if they knew where the nearest doctor was. These staff members would later tell investigators that when Stefan came tumbling into the cafe without his shirt on, looking totally horrible, they assumed he was drunk. But after talking to him, he didn't smell at all like alcohol. Instead, he reeked of this horrible sulfur smell. The staff would tell Stefan that the nearest doctor was 45 miles away. And so at this point, Stefan decided his best bet was actually to just get on a bus and go back to Winnipeg, where his family could take him to the nearest hospital. And so somehow, Stefan managed to make his way to the bus stop. He hopped on a Greyhound bus, he went to Winnipeg, and then his oldest son, Mark, met him at the bus stop and practically carried him into the hospital. The very strange checkerboard burn pattern found on Stefan's abdomen, where he claims this craft turned its vent, then fired on him, were determined not to be thermal burns, meaning he didn't get them from something hot touching his skin, like everyone initially suspected. Instead, they were determined to be chemical burns, but literally no one, doctors, scientists, government agencies, no one could figure out what chemical actually burned his skin. In fact, no one was ever able to actually identify what was causing all of these ailments that Stefan was complaining of, from the headache to the nausea to the weakness to these burns, and he was tested for basically everything, from radiation poisoning to very common ailments and illnesses, and everything came back negative. Experts would go out to Falcon Lake, to the area that Stefan described seeing this craft, and sure enough, they would find an open rock face, and right around the area that Stefan described was this circular burn pattern, as if something had been perched right there that shot some sort of exhaust into the ground, and the area around this landing site was determined to be highly radioactive, although it is assumed that the reason that area is radioactive is because there is a vein of radium that runs underneath the rocks near the area. However, what no one could explain away were the 3 identical pieces of what looked like metal, which actually turned out to be a very rare type of silver, that were located near this burn circle. Now, even though the Falcon Lake area was known apparently for having silver deposits up in the hillsides, this silver, these 3 pieces of silver, were not from the hillsides of Falcon Lake. This silver was heavily manufactured. Someone, something, some machine had manipulated the metal to bend and be cut in a very particular way. And all 3 of these pieces of very rare silver were highly radioactive. They would also find traces of this very rare type of silver that seemed to have seeped into some of the loose rocks that were inside of that burned out circle, almost like the silver had melted into the rock. But despite these pieces of evidence that do seem to suggest that Stefan really did see some craft land on these rocks, and despite the fact that the US government and the Canadian government both thoroughly investigated this case, and they were not able to debunk it, they basically said, well, something happened, but we don't know what. Despite all of that, Stefan and his family's lives were forever upended after this incident. Stefan was ridiculed and accused of lying and of being crazy, and his kids were unfortunately bullied at school. Shortly before Stefan died in 1999 at the age of 83, he was asked if he regretted coming forward with this story. And he would say, yes, I wish I never told anyone. But he would also say at the time, he really felt like he had a duty to tell the world about what happened. Stefan never changed his story, and he never came out and said, I think this craft came from another world, another planet, another universe. He just said, look, I think it was an experimental aircraft. That's it. He also never made a dime on this experience. If anything, he lost money because he paid to write a 40-page pamphlet that explained what happened to him, and then he left all these copies on his porch. So if news people showed up or if nosy neighbors showed up and had questions, he would just point to the stack of the books and say, take one and read it. So that's going to do it. If you got something out of today's episode and you haven't done this already, please ask the like button if you can borrow their favorite DVD, but instead of watching it, use it to play Frisbee with your dog and then return it. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. We have a podcast called the MrBallen's Podcast that puts out brand new podcast exclusive episodes on Monday mornings, and on Thursday mornings, we upload the remastered audio of our best YouTube videos. Right now, that podcast is available on all platforms, but starting on November 1st of this year, 2022, the podcast is going to be exclusively available on Amazon Music. We have a registered 501c3 charitable organization called the MrBallen's Foundation that makes it as easy as possible for you to join me, my family, and my team in supporting those whose lives have been most impacted by violent and heinous crimes. Monthly donors to the MrBallen's Foundation Honor Them Society will receive free gifts and exclusive invites to special live events. But the real reward is helping to create a new ending to the story for victims of violent crime. Go to MrBallen.Foundation and click on Get Involved to join the Honor Them Society today. We also have 2 additional YouTube channels. One is called MrBallen's Shorts. The other is called MrBallen en Espanol. We also put out near daily content on TikTok, Facebook, and Snapchat. All of those pages are just called MrBallen. If you want to get in touch with me, please follow me on any major social media platform and then send me a direct message. My username on all platforms is just @MrBallen, and I really do read the majority of my DMs. We also have some really cool merchandise, so head on over to shopmrballen.com to have a look. And if you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit just called MrBallen. It's linked in the description below. So whether I see you on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, Facebook, other YouTube channels, the podcast, wherever, just know that I really appreciate your support. And until next time, that's going to do it. See ya.